Breaking tonight, the Élysée Palace just became ground zero for the most significant diplomatic rebuke of American foreign policy in a generation. Emmanuel Macron didn't hedge, he didn't equivocate. Standing before France's assembled ambassadors, the president of the French Republic looked directly into the camera and called out Donald Trump's threats against Canadian sovereignty by name. And what happened next reveals exactly why Mark Carney's strategy of building European partnerships wasn't defensive positioning. It was prophetic preparation for the moment when America's closest allies would finally say enough. Because here's what nobody in Washington calculated. When you threaten to annex your neighbor, when you treat sovereignty like a real estate transaction, when you turn alliances into hostage situations, eventually the rest of the democratic world stops pretending your behavior is normal. They start building alternatives. And tonight, those alternatives have names, addresses, and the full diplomatic weight of the European Union behind them. Tensions are escalating across the Atlantic tonight. Donald Trump attempted to intimidate Canada through annexation rhetoric, but instead of capitulation, Ottawa accelerated European partnership development. The threat that was supposed to demonstrate American dominance just triggered the most comprehensive transatlantic realignment since the Marshall Plan. Everyone believed Trump's 51st state threats were negotiating tactics designed to extract concessions. Political analysts expected Canada to moderate its positions and seek accommodation with Washington. Financial markets assumed Ottawa would prioritize American relationships above all others to avoid economic retaliation. They were all utterly incorrect. Paris, January the 9th, 2026. Emmanuel Macron stands before France's diplomatic corps in the Élysée presidential palace. And he doesn't mince words. It's the greatest disorder, the law of the strongest, and everyday people wonder whether Greenland will be invaded, whether Canada will be under the threat of becoming the 51st state of the United States. Let me translate what just happened. The president of France looked at the world and said out loud what everyone was thinking. American threats against Canadian sovereignty aren't just bad diplomacy. They're watching the entire rules-based order collapse in real time. And he wasn't alone. What happened next exposes the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Trump's strategy. The bullying that was supposed to isolate Canada instead isolated America. The threats that were supposed to demonstrate strength revealed weakness. And the prime minister who refused to capitulate, Mark Carney, suddenly found himself leading a coalition of democracies that spans from Ottawa to Berlin to Paris. Dear viewers, between November 2025 and January 2026, something extraordinary happened in transatlantic relationships. Washington pushed too hard. Ottawa said no. And Europe, democratic, principled Europe, became the partner every Canadian strategic planner had been quietly preparing to embrace. Here's what makes Macron's speech so devastating for Trump's approach. This wasn't a private diplomatic cable. This wasn't background chatter to reporters. This was the president of France, speaking on the record to his nation's ambassadors, explicitly citing threats against Canada as evidence that America is gradually turning away from some of its allies and freeing itself from international rules. Let that sink in for a moment. The leader of a permanent UN Security Council member, a nuclear power, a G7 economy, just publicly categorized American threats against Canada in the same sentence as potential invasions of Greenland and pressure on Taiwan. Trump's 51st state rhetoric isn't being treated as eccentric commentary. It's being analyzed as a preview of American territorial ambitions, and Macron wasn't finished. The law of the strongest, he called it. The breakdown of international norms, the sacrifice of allies for raw power calculations. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Macron's speech wasn't happening in isolation. Just hours before, on Wednesday evening, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier delivered his own warning at a symposium in Germany. And his language was even more stark. It is about preventing the world from turning into a den of robbers, where the most unscrupulous take whatever they want, where regions or entire countries are treated as the property of a few great powers. A den of robbers. German officials are now describing American foreign policy in the same terms they use for authoritarian regimes. And they're doing it publicly, on the record, with the full weight of their offices behind them. Now watch what Carney did while Trump was busy threatening annexation. Because this is where strategic patience reveals its true power. January 8th, 2026. The Prime Minister's office releases a readout of Carney's conversation with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The topic: Their shared support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Denmark, including Greenland, which must be respected in accordance with international law. Notice the language: shared support, territorial integrity, international law. This isn't a phone call between a nervous, smaller nation and a sympathetic European leader. This is coordination between equals on a matter of fundamental principle. And then comes the line that reveals everything. Prime Minister Carney reaffirmed that the future of Greenland is for Greenland and Denmark to determine. Translation: Canada is now actively coordinating with European powers to defend sovereignty principles in the Arctic, which just happens to be the exact same framework Canada needs defended for its own territory. Carney didn't wait for American threats to materialize into action. He built the alliance structure that makes those threats irrelevant. While Trump was tweeting about the 51st state, Ottawa was on secure calls with Berlin discussing Arctic security architecture. This is what professional statecraft looks like. And Europe noticed, but let's move beyond diplomatic statements to something harder to spin. Public opinion data, because this is where Trump's strategy reveals its complete failure. ARD, Germany's public broadcaster, released polling data on January 9th. The question was simple: do Germans view the United States as a reliable partner? The answer, 76% said no. That's not a typo. 3/4 of Germans, citizens of America's most important European ally, no longer trust the United States. And that number increased 3 percentage points just since June 2025, as Trump's threats against neighbors intensified. Only 15% of Germans now trust America, the lowest level ever recorded in this regular survey. By contrast, 75% trust France, 75% trust Britain, the same countries that are now publicly defending Canadian sovereignty while criticizing American behavior. And it gets worse for Washington. 69% of Germans are now concerned about security in Europe. The same percentage believes NATO partners cannot rely on American protection, despite the US being the alliance's strongest member. Let me translate those numbers into strategic reality. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, the linchpin of NATO's Eastern Front, the country that hosts American military bases and nuclear weapons, has concluded that America is unreliable. And they're responding by building alternative security partnerships. Guess which country is perfectly positioned to benefit from that shift? The one whose prime minister spent the last 2 months building relationships with every European capital while Trump was busy threatening annexation. Remember the criticism Carney faced when he started pivoting toward Europe? The commentators who said Canada couldn't afford to antagonize Washington. The analysts who insisted American markets were too important to risk. Watch what happened instead. Europe didn't just defend Canadian sovereignty in abstract terms. They're building concrete partnerships, trade agreements, security cooperation, Arctic coordination, the infrastructure of a transatlantic alliance that operates independently of American volatility. And it's not because Europe suddenly loves Canada. It's because Europe sees in Canada's experience a preview of their own vulnerability. Today, Trump threatens to make Canada the 51st state. Tomorrow, he could threaten economic warfare against Germany for insufficient defense spending. Next week, he might demand territorial concessions in return for NATO protection. Macron and Steinmeier aren't defending Canada out of charity. They're defending the principle that sovereignty cannot be treated as negotiable. Because if Canada can be threatened with annexation, so can anyone. That makes Canada strategically valuable in a way that has nothing to do with oil exports or lumber imports. Canada becomes the test case for whether democracies will defend each other against bullying, regardless of the bully's size. And Carney understood that calculation before Trump made his first 51st state comment. That's why Ottawa was already building European relationships. That's why Canadian officials were already coordinating Arctic policy with Denmark and Norway. That's why Carney can pick up the phone and immediately connect with the German chancellor about Greenland sovereignty. Here's what makes this week so significant. Macron and Steinmeier's speeches represent the first time major European leaders have directly, publicly, and explicitly condemned American threats against Canada. Not through careful diplomatic language, not through both sides' equivocation, through clear, unambiguous denunciation of behavior they describe as the breakdown of international order. That's not a small shift. That's the tectonic plates of global alliances moving in real time. And do you notice the timing? These speeches came after Trump's recent actions in Venezuela, after his renewed focus on Greenland, after weeks of behavior that suggested, as former Canadian UN Ambassador Bob Rae warned, that Canada is on the menu. for American hemispheric ambitions. Europe looked at that pattern and decided they needed to draw a line. Not later, not through back channels. Now, and publicly. The escalation is significant because earlier European responses to Trump's behavior were carefully neutral, calls for all parties to respect international law without naming names, the diplomatic equivalent of thoughts and prayers. But as one expert told Global News, European leaders were trying not to anger a volatile White House during ongoing trade and security negotiations. They were hoping quiet diplomacy would moderate American behavior. That hope is dead. Macron and Steinmeier aren't trying to manage Trump anymore. They're building coalitions to contain him. And Canada is a central member of that coalition, not because Ottawa asked to join, but because Carney's strategy made Canada indispensable to its success. So where does this leave us? With a fundamentally transformed transatlantic relationship, with European powers publicly defending Canadian sovereignty, with polling data showing collapse in European trust toward America, with coordination between Ottawa and Berlin on Arctic security, with France explicitly citing threats against Canada as evidence of American abandonment of allies. This isn't the world Trump thought he was creating when he started threatening the 51st state. He thought he was demonstrating American dominance. Instead, he triggered the exact coalition that makes Canadian independence more secure than it was before the threats began. And here's the beautiful irony that Carney must appreciate every time he reads another European defense of Canadian sovereignty. Trump's bullying didn't weaken Canada's position. It revealed that Canada's real strategic value isn't as a resource supplier to American markets. It's as a principled democracy that other principled democracies will defend, because their own security depends on defending sovereignty as an absolute principle. You can't buy that kind of strategic positioning. You can only earn it through consistent defense of international law, through building relationships before you need them, through refusing to capitulate when threatened. Carney did all three, and now, when the president of France speaks to his diplomatic corps, when the German president warns about the world becoming a den of robbers, they're not just defending abstract principles, they're defending Canada by name, with specifics, with the full weight of their offices. That's not luck. That's statecraft. And it's working exactly as designed. Tonight, across European capitals, democratic leaders are watching Trump's behavior, and they're reaching the same conclusion. You can't have a rules-based international order if sovereignty is up for grabs. Canada isn't becoming the 51st state. Greenland isn't getting invaded. Taiwan isn't being abandoned, period. And the leader who understood that reality first, who built partnerships before the crisis, who refused to blink when threatened, was Mark Carney. The prime minister who Trump thought he could bully into submission is now coordinating transatlantic defense of sovereignty principles with the leaders of France and Germany. The country that was supposed to capitulate is instead becoming the test case for whether democracies will defend each other in the face of authoritarianism. Europe didn't just reject Trump's threats against Canada, they did something smarter. They turned those threats into the foundation of a new transatlantic alliance. And in that alliance, Ottawa sits at the table as an equal partner, not a junior resource appendage, not a hemispheric afterthought, an equal partner in defending the principles that keep democracies alive. Everyone believed American threats would force Canadian accommodation. They were all utterly incorrect. And the alliance that's emerging from Europe's rejection of those threats reveals exactly why Carney's strategy wasn't defensive. It was preparation for the moment when principle would matter more than proximity. That moment arrived this week in Paris, and it's just getting started.